Welcome to Family Shadows, a place where stories of sacrifice, love, and quiet redemption come alive. If family stories move you, if you believe every father's journey carries a lesson, then I invite you. Click subscribe, join our community, and never miss the stories that might just remind you of your own. Tonight's story is titled, "They Mocked the Shirt My Wife Sewed, so I wore it to take back my pride." And now, let us begin. Leonard Brooks was 65 years old, and in many ways he looked the part. His hair had turned a soft shade of gray. His skin bore the weathered lines of a man who had worked with his hands, and his walk had slowed with the years. Yet, there was a dignity about him, something in the way he carried himself. Something that made you think of strength not flaunted, but earned quietly over decades. What stood out most about Leonard wasn't his gray hair or the tired creases in his palms, but a shirt. A simple, faded cotton shirt, cream-colored with thin blue lines crossing through it, not perfectly symmetrical, stitched by hand. If you looked closely, you would see tiny irregularities, an extra length of thread here, a line that veered slightly there. But if you knew its story, you would never see those as imperfections. Because that shirt was sewn by his late wife, Margaret. She had given it to him 35 years earlier, when money was tight and Leonard couldn't justify buying anything new. Margaret had smiled that evening, her brown eyes glowing beneath the yellow kitchen light. She had held out the shirt like it was something precious, even though it had been pieced together from fabric she found on sale at a thrift store. "I wanted you to have something of your own," she had told him, "something stitched with love." And Leonard had worn it ever since. Not every day, of course. The fabric was fragile now, the colors faded by wash and sunlight. But every time he pulled it over his shoulders, he felt Margaret beside him. It was as though her hands were still resting on the seams, as though her laughter was stitched into the collar. He wore it not because it looked good, but because it reminded him of who he was and who he had loved. To Leonard, the shirt was pride. To others, it was just old. His son, Lucas Brooks, had grown into a different kind of man. At 36, Lucas was everything Leonard never was. Ambitious, image-conscious, polished. He had traded the oil-stained overalls of his father's generation for tailored suits and shoes that cost more than Leonard's first car. Lucas was proud of the life he had built, his corporate job, his shiny new house in the suburbs, his circle of successful friends. And beside him was Olivia, his wife. Olivia was polite, elegant, and unfailingly proper. She had a way of smiling at Leonard that was cordial, never cruel but never warm either. Like many in Lucas's world, she measured respectability in appearances, polished wood floors, perfectly cooked dinners, and the right clothes for the right occasions. Which is why the old shirt never quite belonged at their dinner table. It was a Saturday evening in spring when Leonard first felt the sting of mockery. Lucas and Olivia had invited him over for dinner, a small family gathering, nothing extravagant, just a chance to share a meal. Leonard had dressed simply, as he always did, and he had chosen the old shirt. To him, it felt like the most honest way to arrive at his son's home, not dressed up to impress, not pretending to be someone else, but carrying a piece of his history. When he walked into the dining room, Olivia glanced up. Her eyes lingered on the shirt for a moment longer than they should have. She smiled, polite as ever, but her lips curved just a touch too tightly. Lucas, already pouring wine into tall glasses, looked up and let out a small chuckle. "Dad," he said, shaking his head, "you're still wearing that thing." Leonard looked down at the fabric. "Why wouldn't I?" he asked softly. Lucas grinned, but it wasn't a kind grin. It looks like it came out of a time capsule from the 70s. Don't you think it's time to upgrade?" Olivia, never wanting to sound harsh, added in her graceful tone, "It's very vintage, Leonard. But maybe we should take you shopping one day. Something more modern." There was laughter around the table, not loud, not cruel, but enough. Enough to make Leonard press his lips together and hide the words he wanted to say. He looked down at his plate, running a thumb over the edge of his fork, and chose silence. For Leonard, silence was not weakness. It was how he carried his pride without shoving it into others' faces. Still, in that moment, silence hurt. The meal went on. Conversations about promotions, about Olivia's upcoming charity luncheon, about a new car Lucas had test-driven. Leonard ate slowly, nodding when appropriate, smiling faintly when spoken to. But his mind wasn't in the room. His mind was back in that yellow-lit kitchen 35 years ago, when Margaret had handed him the shirt with such joy, proud to have made something with her own hands. The memory rose like a tide. He remembered her laugh when the collar sat crooked. He remembered her playful scolding when he spilled soup on it the very first week. He remembered her hand smoothing the wrinkles before church, whispering, "You look handsome." To Margaret, it had never been about the stitches. It had always been about love. But how could he explain that to Lucas, to Olivia, to anyone who measured worth in brands and labels? He could say the words, but would they understand? Would they even listen? That night, back in his quiet home, Leonard hung the shirt carefully on its wooden hanger. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at it in the dim light. The house was silent, too silent without Margaret. He whispered to the shirt as though Margaret could hear through the fabric. "They don't see you the way I do," he murmured. "But I'll keep wearing you no matter what they say." Outside, the street lamps glowed. Inside, Leonard folded his hands and closed his eyes, carrying both pride and sorrow in equal measure. Because sometimes love, when misunderstood, feels heavier than loneliness. The following weekend, Leonard once again found himself driving down the neatly paved streets of his son's neighborhood. The houses stood tall and polished, lawns trimmed to precise lengths, flower beds arranged as if painted. It was the kind of neighborhood Margaret would have admired for its order, but Leonard couldn't help feeling out of place every time he turned onto Lucas's street. His old pickup rumbled against the quiet. Most cars here were gleaming sedans and SUVs, their paint catching the afternoon sun. His truck, with its fading red paint and a dent near the back fender, looked like an outsider like him. Leonard parked a few houses down out of habit. He never liked leaving his truck right in front of Lucas's place. He didn't want his son's neighbors to whisper about the old man with the beat-up vehicle. He climbed out slowly, patting the dashboard as he closed the door. Margaret used to call the truck Old Faithful. Every scratch told a story. Every dent carried a memory. Carrying a small pie he had baked earlier that morning, an apple pie, the kind Margaret used to make, Leonard walked up to the Brooks' front porch. Before he could knock, the door swung open. "Dad," Lucas said, smiling, but his eyes darted briefly to the shirt, the same shirt. Leonard had chosen it deliberately. It felt like armor, even in its fragility. "Evening, son," Leonard replied, holding up the pie. "Brought dessert." Lucas stepped aside, gesturing him in. "Thanks, Olivia will like that." The dining room was already set, candles flickering in the center. Olivia appeared from the kitchen, her blonde hair pulled back neatly, apron tied around her waist. She leaned forward to kiss Leonard's cheek politely. "Leonard, it smells wonderful," she said, taking the pie from him. But her gaze, almost unconsciously, flickered once more toward the shirt. She didn't comment, but the small pause was enough. Dinner began with pleasantries. roast chicken, green beans, wine poured into tall glasses. Leonard sat across from his son and daughter-in-law, his movements slow, deliberate. He cut his chicken carefully, listening as Lucas spoke about a potential promotion, about the new partnership his company was forming. Olivia chimed in with details about her volunteer committee, the charity gala they were planning for the following month. For a while, Leonard simply listened, nodding occasionally. He never wanted to interrupt, never wanted to sound out of place in their polished conversations. But soon the moment arrived. Lucas glanced at his father, eyes narrowing slightly, lips twitching. "Dad," he said, pausing for effect, "do you really still wear that shirt?" Leonard looked up, his fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Lucas chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I mean, come on, that thing looks older than me, doesn't it, Olivia?" Olivia shifted uncomfortably. She didn't want to sound harsh, but she also didn't want to disagree. "It's very retro," she said softly. Then, with a laugh too quick, she added, "maybe a little too retro." The words lingered, retro, too retro. Leonard lowered his fork, setting it gently on his plate. He forced a small smile. "It's comfortable," he said quietly. Lucas smirked, swirling the wine in his glass. "Comfortable isn't always a good thing. Dad, you should let Olivia take you shopping, something new, something that doesn't look like—" He stopped, chuckling. "Like a museum piece." The laughter that followed was light, almost harmless. But to Leonard it cut deeper than they realized. He pressed his palm against the fabric on his chest, feeling the uneven stitching, remembering Margaret's hands guiding the needle. He wanted to tell them. He wanted to say, "Your mother made this shirt. She sewed it when we had nothing, when love was all we could afford. Every thread carries her touch. I wear it because she is gone, and this is what I have left." But the words caught in his throat. His pride would not let him plead for their understanding. Instead, he smiled faintly as if their comments didn't matter. "Maybe someday," he said softly, "but for now this one suits me just fine." The conversation moved on. Lucas launched into another story about a deal closing at work. Olivia passed the beans, her expression neutral. The laughter, the chatter, it filled the room again. But for Leonard, it all felt distant. He ate in silence, each bite tasteless, his mind drifting. He thought of the times Margaret had sewn late into the night, her fingers pricked and calloused, yet her spirit never dimmed. He thought of her sitting beside him at church, proudly smoothing the shirt's wrinkles, whispering, "You look handsome." And he thought of how, in this house filled with polished furniture and crystal glasses, her gift was nothing more than a punchline. Later, when the plates were cleared and coffee poured, Leonard excused himself early. "Long day," he muttered, rising from the table. Lucas and Olivia didn't press him. They kissed his cheek, thanked him for coming, promised they'd see him again soon. But as Leonard stepped out into the cool night air, the laughter from inside followed him like an echo. He walked down the porch steps slowly, pie tin empty in his hands, the shirt warm against his chest. At his truck, he paused. He placed the pie tin on the passenger seat, then sat behind the wheel, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The shirt's collar was frayed, the fabric thin, but in his eyes it was still the finest thing he owned. He whispered to himself, almost as if Margaret were sitting beside him. "They don't see it, love, but I do, and I always will." The engine roared to life and Leonard drove off into the night. When Leonard returned home that night, the house greeted him with silence. Not the kind of silence that soothes, like waves rolling against a shore, but the hollow kind. The kind that presses against your chest and makes you hear your own breathing too loudly. He set the pie tin on the kitchen counter, its emptiness echoing the emptiness of the room. For a moment, He simply stood there, staring at the faint ring it left on the countertop, as though expecting Margaret's voice to rise from the shadows and tell him to wash it before it stained. But of course, no voice came. The shirt clung to his shoulders. He touched the collar, tracing the crooked seam with his thumb. How many times had Margaret teased herself for not sewing it straight? "It'll do," she had laughed, eyes shining with that warmth only she possessed. "I made it for your shoulders, not for a fashion show." Back then, Leonard had pulled her close, kissed the top of her head, and told her it was perfect. He hadn't lied. He never would. He walked into the living room, the floorboards creaking beneath his slow steps. The photographs along the mantel told the story of a life that felt like another man's now. There was one of Lucas as a boy, holding a baseball bat too big for his small hands. Leonard crouched behind him, guiding his grip. Another of Margaret, flour on her cheek, waving a spoon toward the camera, pretending to scold. Leonard sank into his armchair. The fabric groaned under his weight, familiar, worn. He closed his eyes and let the memory swell. He thought of the early years with Margaret, the years of making do. When they couldn't afford vacations, they took drives in the truck with a thermos of coffee and 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. When money was tight, Margaret learned to sew, patching holes in his pants, stitching dresses for Lucas's school plays. And when Leonard felt he wasn't giving his family enough, she would place her hand on his and whisper, "We have everything that matters." That shirt, the one now mocked, had once been her proudest creation. She had stayed up past midnight finishing it, holding it up to the dim light of the kitchen lamp. He remembered walking in half asleep, seeing her bent over the fabric. "You should rest," he'd said. "I will," she replied, smiling, "after I give this to you." She had slipped it into his hands, soft but sturdy, and he had understood this was more than clothing. This was love turned tangible. Now, decades later, it was all he had left of her that felt alive. Her jewelry stayed in a small box, untouched. Her books sat on a shelf, their spines fading, but the shirt, he wore it. He carried her with him, literally against his skin. And tonight his son had laughed at it. Leonard's chest tightened. He wasn't angry, not in the way younger men flare up at insult. It was a heavier kind of hurt, the kind that doesn't shout but sinks deep, like a stone dropping into still water. He had always taught Lucas to value effort, to respect meaning over appearance. Yet somewhere along the way that lesson had slipped through his son's fingers like dust. Maybe he had failed in teaching. Maybe he had been too quiet, too patient, too willing to let others speak while he listened. He wondered if silence, his old companion, had betrayed him. The clock ticked steadily on the wall. Outside, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Leonard leaned back, folding his hands across the shirt's fabric. "Margaret," he whispered into the empty room, "they don't understand. Not yet, maybe they never will." He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment he imagined her there. He could almost hear her humming as she stirred a pot on the stove, almost smell the cinnamon of her baking. He let himself sink into that illusion, clinging to it as though it were air in a drowning sea. The night wore on, shadows stretching across the walls. Leonard dozed in the chair, waking once to the sound of wind brushing against the windows. He rose slowly, joints aching, and walked to the bedroom. Hanging the shirt carefully on its wooden hanger, he paused, fingers gripping the sleeve. "They can laugh if they want," he murmured, "but I'll never stop wearing you." He laid down, staring at the ceiling. Sleep came in fragments, broken by memories that felt too vivid, too sharp. Margaret's laughter, Lucas's voice mocking, the collision of past and present twisted inside him. And before dawn broke, one thought solidified in Leonard's mind. One day, somehow, he would make them see. The next week passed slowly, filled with the kind of small routines that defined Leonard's life. Mornings began with coffee brewed in the same chipped mug Margaret had given him on his 50th birthday. Afternoons were spent tending to the modest garden out back, pulling weeds, watering tomatoes, trimming the rose bush that Margaret once adored. Evenings were quiet, the house echoing with absence, his only company the soft hum of the radio and the occasional creak of old wood settling in. It was on a Wednesday evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the kitchen walls gold, that the phone rang. Leonard wiped his hands on a rag, picked it up, and heard his son's voice on the line. "Dad," Lucas said, his tone unusually cheerful, "Olivia and I were talking. There's a dinner party next Saturday. Some of my colleagues, a few friends from Olivia's charity board, we'd like you to come." Leonard's brows lifted in surprise. Lucas rarely invited him to such gatherings. A dinner party. Yes, Lucas continued, formal but not too formal. "Just, a good chance to meet people. We'd love for you to be there." There was a hesitation, barely a breath, but Leonard heard it. The kind of pause that told more than the words that followed. "Of course," Leonard said quietly. "I'd be glad to come." When the call ended, Leonard stood for a long moment, the receiver still in his hand. He thought about what Margaret would have said, how she would have fussed over which tie he wore, how she would have ironed his shirt until not a wrinkle remained. He smiled faintly at the memory, then set the phone down. Saturday came quickly. Leonard dressed slowly that afternoon, pulling clothes from his modest closet. A navy jacket, pressed slacks, polished shoes. And then his hand stopped at the old shirt, the one Margaret had made. It hung there, quiet but insistent, as though it were calling his name. He laid it across the bed, fingers smoothing the faded fabric. He could almost hear Margaret's voice again. "Wear it when you need me close." He was still staring at it when the phone rang once more. Lucas's voice filled the line, this time less cheerful, more cautious. "Dad, before tonight, can I ask you something?" "Of course." There was a pause, long enough for Leonard to feel his son's discomfort. "Please don't wear that old shirt," Lucas said finally. "You know the one I mean." Leonard's chest tightened. He said nothing, waiting. "It's just," Lucas cleared his throat. "These are people from work. They notice things. Appearance matters. I don't want anyone judging you or me." The words landed like stones, heavy and unyielding. Leonard's eyes fell back to the shirt on the bed. His voice, when it came, was steady but soft. "I see," he said. "Thanks, Dad." "I knew you'd understand," Lucas replied quickly, relief in his tone. "We'll see you tonight." The line went dead. Leonard sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the fabric beneath his hands. The shirt, once a symbol of love, now stood between him and his son's pride. He traced the stitches with his fingers, each one a reminder of Margaret's devotion, each one a thread tying him to a life that was slipping further away. Did Lucas truly not see? Did Olivia? Or had the world changed so much that love sewn into cloth no longer mattered? The house was silent again, but inside Leonard's chest the silence thundered. He rose slowly, holding the shirt against him for a long moment, then folded it neatly and placed it back on the hanger. He would go to the dinner party. He would smile, nod, listen. He would play the role of the quiet father, the background figure at his son's polished table. But deep inside something stirred, a flicker of resistance, a whisper of Margaret's laughter. And though he said nothing, Leonard knew. The shirt's time was not over. The night of the dinner came with the kind of chill that seeps through spring evenings, a reminder that winter was never too far behind. Leonard drove his old truck down streets that gleamed beneath yellow lamps, passing manicured lawns and doorsteps lit with tasteful lanterns. His fingers gripped the steering wheel loosely. the fabric of his shirt brushing against his skin like a quiet heartbeat. Yes, the shirt. The very one Lucas had asked him not to wear. He had stared at it for hours earlier that afternoon, torn between obedience and pride. He could have chosen the navy jacket, the safer option, the garment that would draw no attention. But in the end, his hands reached for Margaret's creation. Not out of defiance, not to prove Lucas wrong, but because Leonard knew that if he left it behind tonight, it would be like leaving her behind too. And he couldn't. Not here. Not now. The house hosting the dinner was larger than Lucas's, grand, with tall windows that spilled light across the front lawn. Cars lined the driveway, polished and new, their chrome glinting beneath the street lamps. Leonard parked at the edge of the block, as he often did, and walked the rest of the way. Each step felt heavier than the last, though his back remained straight, his pace steady. When he entered, the warmth of chatter and laughter hit him like a wall. The foyer shimmered with chandeliers, the air filled with the faint scent of wine and roasted meats. Men in tailored suits stood with glasses in hand. Women in sleek dresses leaned close in conversation. Leonard stepped inside, his shoes creaking against the polished floor. It didn't take long. Eyes turned toward him, subtle at first, then lingering. A pause in conversation, a whispered remark behind a hand. Someone chuckled, quickly stifled. Leonard felt it all. The scanning glance down his shirt, the judgment in their eyes, the question that hung unspoken. Why would he wear that? Lucas spotted him from across the room, relief flashing for a brief second before his expression faltered. His smile stiffened. He walked briskly to his father, Olivia trailing behind with a glass of champagne in her hand. "Dad," Lucas whispered, leaning close, his tone tight. "You wore it." Leonard looked at him calmly, eyes steady. "Yes, I did." Lucas forced a smile for the guests nearby, but his jaw clenched. Olivia touched Leonard's arm gently, her voice sweet but laced with discomfort. "Leonard, it's charming," she said softly, "but maybe tonight wasn't the best night for vintage." Leonard nodded once, not replying. He moved past them into the room, shoulders square despite the growing weight of stares. The evening unfolded like a performance in which Leonard had no script. Guests laughed loudly at jokes he didn't understand, clinked glasses over deals and vacations. Leonard lingered near the edges, a quiet figure observing a world that seemed so far from his own. Every so often he caught another glance at his shirt, sometimes curious, sometimes amused, sometimes pitying. At one point, a man in a gray suit leaned toward his companion, muttering just loud enough for Leonard to hear. "Looks like something my grandfather would wear to mow the lawn." The two laughed quietly, their eyes flicking in his direction. Leonard felt heat rise in his chest, but he didn't move, didn't speak. He stood still, hands clasped before him, as if rooted in something deeper than their laughter could touch. Across the room, Lucas laughed at a colleague's story, but his eyes kept darting back toward his father, unease gnawing at him. Olivia sipped her champagne, her smile faltering whenever another whisper passed too close. Leonard drifted toward the buffet table, more for refuge than for food. He placed a small portion of salad on his plate, though he had little appetite. Around him, the conversations swirled, rising and falling like waves. And always the shirt, Margaret's shirt, seemed to glow beneath the lights. Not flashy but unignorable, drawing eyes whether in mockery or curiosity. For Leonard, each stare was a test. Each smirk a reminder of how far the world had drifted from the values he once knew. But he kept standing tall, because for him this wasn't just fabric. It was Margaret's voice telling him he was worthy, no matter what the world said. Still, As the night wore on, the wait grew. By the time coffee was served and dessert plates clinked against china, Leonard felt like a man standing in the center of a storm, silent and alone, enduring the winds of judgment without a shield. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a thought pulsed like a quiet drum. This isn't the end of the story. The dinner had stretched into its third hour when the host of the evening, a silver-haired man named Gregory Wells, rose from his chair and clinked a spoon gently against his glass. The sound rang across the room, soft yet commanding, and one by one the conversations hushed. Gregory smiled warmly, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone used to commanding attention. "Friends," he said, "thank you for being here tonight. Before we end this wonderful evening, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a few individuals who have supported our community in ways most don't see." Leonard, standing quietly near the back of the room with his half-finished cup of coffee, hardly paid much attention at first. He assumed Gregory would thank the donors, the board members, the familiar names and faces that filled the room. He shifted slightly, thinking perhaps it was time to slip out to find the comfort of his old truck waiting in the cool night air. But then Gregory's eyes scanned the crowd and stopped. "Mr. Leonard Brooks," he said, smiling as if he had found a hidden gem among polished stones, "would you come forward, please?" A ripple of surprise moved through the guests. Heads turned, whispers fluttered. Leonard froze where he stood, his name echoing in his ears. Lucas stiffened across the room, his glass pausing midair. Olivia's eyes widened, a flicker of nervousness darting across her face. Leonard's instinct was to decline, to wave a hand politely and remain where he was. But Gregory gestured again, warmly insistent. "Come, Mr. Brooks, we'd be honored." And so, with steady but reluctant steps, Leonard walked toward the front. He felt the weight of every stare, the murmur of every whispered question. He climbed the small step onto the platform where Gregory stood, and for a moment he was blinded by the chandelier's light above. Gregory placed a hand on Leonard's shoulder. "Many of you don't know this man," he began. But Leonard has, for years, quietly funded a scholarship program at the local community college. Dozens of young men and women, students who thought college was out of reach, have walked into new futures because of his generosity, and he never once sought recognition. Gasps, murmurs. Guests turned to look again at the man in the old shirt, their eyes now tinged with curiosity, some with shame. Lucas swallowed hard, Olivia's lips parted, but no words came. Leonard shifted, uncomfortable under the attention. He hadn't wanted anyone to know. He hadn't done it for applause, yet here he was, the spotlight pressing on him, the shirt Margaret had sewn glowing under the bright light. Gregory handed him the microphone. "Would you like to say a few words, Mr. Brooks?" For a moment, Leonard almost refused. But then his hand brushed against the fabric of his shirt and he felt Margaret there, her patience, her strength, her faith in him. He raised the microphone slowly, his voice quiet at first but clear. "This shirt," he said, glancing down, "was sewn by my late wife, Margaret. She made it more than 3 decades ago when we had little money but more love than we knew what to do with. Every thread you see here, every uneven stitch, she put them there with her own hands. And when I wear it, I don't just wear fabric, I carry her with me." The room had fallen into silence. Not a cough, not a whisper, only the soft hum of the chandelier above. Some may see it as old, out of style, but to me, it is timeless. It reminds me that love is never about appearance. Love is about sacrifice. It is about giving when you have little. It is about holding on when the world tells you to let go. He paused, his eyes sweeping the crowd, his gaze settling briefly on Lucas, then Olivia. "I fund scholarships because Margaret believed in young people. She believed that even when life is hard, every person deserves a chance to rise. And I do it quietly because I learned from her that real love never demands applause." His voice cracked just slightly, but he steadied it. "Tonight, I stand here in this shirt, not ashamed but proud, because fashion fades, but love is stitched into us forever." When he lowered the microphone, there was a stillness so profound it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. And then applause. It began softly, a few hands meeting, then grew, spreading like a tide. People rose to their feet, clapping with a sincerity that surprised even themselves. Some had tears in their eyes. Others nodded solemnly, as though they had been reminded of something they'd forgotten. Leonard stood humbly, bowing his head once in acknowledgement. He hadn't spoken to win them. He had spoken because Margaret deserved to be remembered, because her love deserved a place in the room. As he stepped down from the stage, Gregory shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Leonard," he whispered. "You reminded us all of what matters." Leonard returned to his seat, though now it felt different. The stares followed him still, but they had changed. They were no longer mocking. They were softened, thoughtful, touched. The shirt, once the object of ridicule, had become a symbol. Across the room, Lucas sat frozen, shame burning in his chest. Olivia dabbed at the corner of her eye with a napkin, her earlier poise cracked by something raw and undeniable. And Leonard, quiet as always, sat back down, folded his hands, and let the applause wash over him like a tide he had never asked for, but one Margaret might have smiled to see. By the next morning, the story had already traveled farther than Leonard could have imagined. A local journalist, the same young woman who had quietly snapped a photo of him at the dinner, had posted her article online before dawn. By breakfast, it was already spreading across the community. By noon, it was on the front page of the regional paper. Leonard discovered this the simplest way, when his phone began to ring more times in a day than it had in years. At first, it was his neighbor, Mrs. Whittaker, her voice trembling with excitement. "Leonard, I just saw the paper. What a beautiful story. Margaret would be so proud." Then it was a former colleague from the auto shop where Leonard had worked decades ago. "Never knew about those scholarships, Len. You've always been the quiet one, huh? Well, the world knows now." And later, it was strangers, students who had once received the very scholarships he had funded. One young man left a message that Leonard replayed twice just to hear the sincerity in his voice. "Mr. Brooks, I never knew it was you who gave me that chance. I'm graduating this year. Thank you. Thank you for believing in someone you didn't even know." Leonard sat in his armchair, the phone resting on his lap, his old shirt still on his shoulders. He hadn't planned for this. He had never sought applause. Yet here it was, arriving like sunlight through windows he hadn't opened in years. Across town, Lucas scrolled through the same article on his phone. His colleagues had already texted him, "That's your dad. Didn't know he was such a man of character." Some messages carried admiration, others a note of envy. Lucas stared at the photograph, his father standing tall, humble, proud, wearing the very shirt Lucas had begged him not to wear. Shame burned through him. He remembered his laughter at the dinner table, the careless words. It looks like it came out of the 70s. He thought of Olivia's gentle but complicit smile. Now, the same shirt that had embarrassed him was being celebrated as a symbol of timeless love. Olivia sat beside him, the paper spread across her lap. Her eyes moved slowly over the article, her voice quieter than usual. I didn't know about the scholarships, he never said. He never says, Lucas murmured, rubbing his forehead. That's the thing about him, he just does. For the rest of that day, Leonard's phone and mailbox filled with messages. Notes slipped through his door, neighbors dropping by with casseroles as if he'd won some invisible award. But Leonard accepted it all with the same quiet grace he always carried. He thanked them kindly, smiled softly, and then returned to his chair by the window, the shirt a steady weight against his chest. That evening, as the sky darkened and the headlines faded into tomorrow's news cycle, Leonard walked out to his garden. He stood among the roses, their petals curled with the season, and looked up at the first stars. The night air was cool, crisp, and for the first time in years he felt Margaret's presence not only in the stitches of his shirt but in the voices of those who now understood what it meant. He whispered into the twilight as if she might be listening. They see it now, love. They finally see. And though the night was still, he swore he could hear the faintest echo of her laughter drifting through the leaves. The following week, the article was still being passed around. At the grocery store, strangers nodded at Leonard, some stopping to shake his hand. At church on Sunday, people approached him with gentle smiles and whispered, "Your words touched me." A few even wore older clothes proudly, as though to say, "We understand now." But the moment that mattered most came not from strangers. It was late in the evening when Leonard heard a knock at his front door. He opened it to find Lucas and Olivia standing on the porch, not dressed in their usual polished way but in simple sweaters and jeans. Lucas's face carried a weight that words couldn't disguise. "Dad," Lucas said, his voice softer than Leonard had heard in years, "can we come in?" Leonard stepped aside. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret once rolled out pie crusts, the same table where Lucas had done his homework decades ago. Silence hung heavy until Lucas finally spoke. "I read the article over and over, and I realized," his voice cracked. He pressed his hand against his forehead. "I realized I laughed at something I should have honored. I mocked the one thing that meant the most to you, to Mom. I'm sorry, Dad, I really am." Olivia reached across the table, her eyes damp. "We were shallow, Leonard. We thought about appearances, not meaning. You reminded us what lasts. Please forgive us." Leonard looked at them, his weathered hands folded on the table. He had every right to let the silence stretch, to let guilt weigh heavy. But instead he reached across and placed his hand over his son's. "I don't need apologies," he said quietly. "I just need you to remember, love isn't measured by style or status. It's measured by sacrifice, by what we hold onto when the world tells us to let go." Lucas nodded, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "I'll never forget again, Dad. I promise." For the first time in a long time, Leonard felt Margaret's spirit not only in the shirt, but in the circle of family around his table. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both sorrow and joy, and whispered to himself, "They finally see love, they finally see." That night, Leonard hung the shirt carefully back on its wooden hanger. The fabric was worn thin, but under the soft lamplight it looked almost radiant. It wasn't just a shirt anymore. It was a story, a lesson, a legacy. And now it was no longer just his to carry. It belonged to Lucas and Olivia too, and to everyone who had read, listened, or understood. As he turned off the light and let the house settle into silence, Leonard felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The kind of peace that comes when love is finally recognized for what it is, timeless. The story of Leonard Brooks comes to an end here, but its message still lingers. True love never goes out of style, and what is stitched from the heart will live forever in the memories of family. Thank you for listening to this story on family shadows. We wish you and your family good health, happiness, and many peaceful moments with your loved ones. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the ones to come. We look forward to seeing you again on the next emotional journey.